Hey guys, tonight we are diving headfirst into one of the most monumentally petty, absurdly serious, and wonderfully pointless conflicts in all of history, the great egg debate of the 17th century. We're going to a time and place where your breakfast choice wasn't just about satisfying hunger, but about declaring your allegiance in a philosophical war. A war fought not with swords, but with spoons. Forget surviving battles. Your first challenge is to survive breakfast without accidentally committing a social faux pas that could get you shunned by your neighbors. It's a gentle reminder that humans have always been exceptionally good at making a big deal out of nothing. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments what city you're in and what time it is for you. I love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you notice is the chill. It's a damp, persistent cold that the small fire crackling in the hearth can't quite defeat. Morning light, thin and grey, filters through a single, small minus-paned window, illuminating the swirling dust motes in the air. You're sitting at a heavy wooden table, its surface scarred with the knife marks of generations. There's a distinct smell in the air, a mixture of wood smoke, old linen, and a faint, earthy scent of damp stone. This is your morning. It's like 100 others you've known. In front of you sits your breakfast. It's simple, but it's solid. There's a chunk of dark, dense bread, a small clay mug of wheat. Bitter ale water wasn't always the safest bet back then, and the centerpiece of the meal a single, boiled egg, resting snugly in a small, unadorned wooden cup. The egg is warm in your hand. It's smaller and a bit more pointed than the perfectly oval, uniformly colored eggs you might picture today. The chicken that laid, it was likely a scrawny, scrappy creature that spent its days scratching for bugs in the muddy lane outside. You take the egg and, without a single thought, you tap it. Tap, tap, tap. The sound is dull against the wood of the table. A network of fine cracks spreads across one end. Which end? You don't know. You don't care. It's just an egg. It's the end that was pointing up, the end your thumb was nearest to. It's a decision made by reflex, not by reason. Your fingers, calloused and a little grubby, begin to pick away the shell. Little white and brown fragments fall onto the table, next to your trencher. You peel just enough to get a spoon in. The spoon isn't silver or even pewter. It's likely carved from cow horn, smooth and light. You dip it in, breaking through the soft, white membrane and into the yolk, which is a rich, almost orange color. The first bite is warm, comforting, and deeply familiar. You alternate bites of egg with sips of ale and chunks of bread. The entire process mechanical, rhythmic, and utterly unremarkable. This is how you have always eaten an egg. It's how your father ate his eggs, and his father before it. It is, simply, the way. Historians are still debating just how common a meal like this was for an ordinary person in the 17th century. Was an egg a daily staple, or a cherished weekly treat? The records are patchy, and it likely varied enormously based on whether you lived in the city or countryside, and what your station in life was. For you, on this particular morning, it's just breakfast. You scoop out the last of the yolk, scrape the inside of the shell clean, and then, again by pure instinct, you do something crucial. You take your spoon and you crunch the empty shell into tiny pieces. You don't really know why you do it. It's just what's done. A half-minus remembered nursery rhyme, a superstition whispered by your grandmother. Perhaps the old belief, a strange little bit of folklore, was that if you left an eggshell intact, a witch could use it as a boat to sail the seas and stir up terrible storms. It sounds silly if you think about it, but you don't think about it. You just crush the shell. It's a final, thoughtless act to close out a thoughtless meal. You push back from the table, feeling fed and ready to face the day. The world outside the window is exactly as it was yesterday. The sky is the same shade of grey. The future, you assume, will be much the same. You have absolutely no idea that this simple, peaceful, private act of eating an egg is about to become a matter of intense public scrutiny. You are blissfully, wonderfully unaware that a storm is brewing. A storm that has nothing to do with witches in eggshell boats, but everything to do with that simple tap minus tap minus tap. For a few weeks, nothing changes. The rhythm of your days remains unbroken, governed by the sun and the seasons. You work, you eat, you sleep. You continue to eat your eggs, when you have them, in that same thoughtless, automatic way, crushing the shell afterwards to thwart the nautical ambitions of any local witches. The world feels solid, predictable, but then a subtle shift begins, a strange new current in the river of daily chatter. You first hear it at the market, a snatch of conversation between two merchants haggling over the price of wool. One of them scoffs and says, "That's as daft as Fipple's egg theory." The other just shakes his head and chuckles. You don't know who Fipple is, or what his theory might be, and you forget the comment almost as soon as you hear it. But then you hear it again. A few days later, the blacksmith's apprentice, a young man known more for his strong back than his sharp mind, is earnestly explaining something to a group of stable boys. He is gesturing with a piece of charcoal on a barrel head, trying to draw an egg. He uses words you don't quite understand. Words like rationality and innate orientation. It all seems very serious and very silly. The source of this new madness, you soon discover, is a small, unassuming pamphlet that has begun to circulate through the city. It's a flimsy thing, just a few sheets of cheap, greyish paper, poorly printed with smudged ink. It's titled On the Moral and Rational Consumption of the Ovoid or Bay Treatise. The author is a certain dry, Arian Fipple, a philosopher of some local renown who had, until now, been famous for writing dense, unreadable essays on the nature of virtue. Somehow, this one is different. This one is catching on. A literate neighbor reads a passage aloud one evening, and for the first time, you understand what the fuss is about. Dr. Fipple's argument, when you hear it laid out, is both ludicrous and strangely compelling. He argues that an egg is not merely food. It is a symbol of potential, of life itself, and like all things in nature, it has a proper, God-given orientation. The narrow end, he writes, is the celestial point. It aims upward, toward the heavens, representing aspiration, intellect, and the striving of the soul to crack the egg from this end to be a Little-Endian, as his followers are starting to be called, is to affirm one's commitment to reason and higher purpose. The broader end, conversely, is the brute base. It is blunt, earthy, connected to the ground. It represents our baser instincts, our animal nature. More damningly, Fipple points to a small, anatomical curiosity that everyone knows but has never considered: the air sac. That little pocket of air is always at the big end of the egg. To Fipple, this is not a biological necessity for a developing chick. It is a moral vacuum, an intellectual void. To open an egg from this end, to be a Big-Endian, is to embrace emptiness, to begin one's meal with an act of profound intellectual laziness. It is, he proclaims, an affront to God and to the very faculty of human reason. Your first reaction is a snort of derision. This is, without a doubt, the most ridiculous thing you have ever heard. Who has the time or energy to fret over which end of an egg to crack? There is wood to be chopped, water to be hauled, a living to be made. Yet, the idea doesn't just disappear. The printing press, a relatively new force in the world, churns out more and more copies of Fipple's pamphlet. They are cheap enough for almost anyone to buy. And for those who can't read, there's always someone in a tavern or a town square willing to read it aloud. The debate over drive, Fipple's true motives continues among historians to this day. Was he a genuinely obsessive man who truly believed in the moral gravity of breakfast at, or was he a brilliant satirist, a performance artist centuries ahead of his time, holding up a mirror to show how easily the so-minus cold rational minds of his era could be swayed by high-minded nonsense? We will likely never know for sure. What you do know is that the joke is starting to feel less like a joke. The other day, you saw your own neighbor, a perfectly sensible woman, hesitate before preparing her family's meal. You saw her pause, hold an egg up to the light, and deliberately, with a look of intense concentration, tapped the arrow in. She gave you a slightly self-conscious, almost defiant look, as if expecting you to challenge her. You just looked away, a strange unease settling in your stomach. The simple, thoughtless act of eating an egg now required a thought, a choice, and you get the feeling that soon you will be forced to make it. 2. The city's coffee houses are where the idea truly takes root and blossoms into a full-blown intellectual contagion. Before this, you'd only ever walked past these places, catching a whiff of the exotic, bitter scent of coffee and the sweet aroma of tobacco smoke. They are not for people like you. They are for merchants, scholars, poets, and men who wear wigs and own more than one pair of shoes. Inside these dimly lit, wood-paneled rooms, the Fibble debate finds its natural habitat. Imagine yourself for a moment, peeking through a grimy window into one of these establishments. The air inside is thick with smoke, hanging in a permanent blue-grey haze. Men are crowded around small, dark wooden tables, leaning in close, their faces animated in the flickering candlelight. They aren't discussing trade routes or the price of grain. They are arguing, with incredible passion, about eggs. You see a young man with ink-stained fingers perhaps leaping to his feet, a copy of Fippo's pamphlet clutched in his hand. He jabs a finger at it, proclaiming, "It is the triumph of the rational over the primitive." The point is a clear declaration of intent. Across from him, a stout, red-faced merchant slams his pewter mug on the table, slushing dark liquid onto the floor. Nonsense, sir. It is a matter of stability. The broad base provides a firm foundation. It is the practical, solid, man-business approach. This is the new theater of the city. The arguments grow more elaborate with each telling. New layers of evidence are constantly being invented. A self-proclaimed naturalist claims the chick's head is always oriented towards the little end, a clear sign of its innate intellectual superiority. This is, of course, completely untrue. Another man, a minor poet, composes a sonnet on the spot, praising the elegant, tapered perfection of the Little-Endian method, not to be outdone. A Big-Endian sympathizer retorts that the wider opening allows for a more generous and welcoming scoop, a gesture of gastronomic magnanimity. The coffee itself is part of the ritual. This strange new beverage, which many still viewed with suspicion, was believed to sharpen the mind and stimulate debate. Historians now see the rise of the coffee house as a crucial turning point in the development of public opinion and intellectual life. It was a space where ideas, both brilliant and utterly absurd, could be shared, dissected, and amplified. The egg debate was, in a way, the perfect coffee house topic. It required no actual expertise. Everyone could have an opinion, and the stakes were, ostensibly, zero. But the stakes are rising. The debate is no longer confined to these smoky rooms. It's spilling out into the streets. The terms Little-Endian and Big-Endian have become a kind of social shorthand, a quick way to size someone up. Little-Endians are seen as thoughtful, intellectual, perhaps a bit pretentious. Big-Endians are viewed as practical, traditional, maybe a little boorish. It's a simplistic, ridiculous caricature, but it's starting to stick. You start to notice it in small ways. When you buy your eggs, the woman at the store asks, with a sly wink, "A dozen for a Little-Endian, sir." You see street performers putting on show, comical plays where a bumbling fool, the Big-Endian, struggles to open his egg while a clever hero, the Little-Endian, does so with grace and flair. The whole thing is still a bit of a laugh, a city-wide inside joke. But there's a new edge to the laughter. The other day, you saw two well-dressed men get into a shouting match that nearly came to blows. Their faces were red with fury, their wigs slightly askew, and the subject of their rage was, unbelievably, breakfast. One of them had accused the other of culinary barbarism. This is also where we encounter a curious historical footnote, the no-spooneress. A tiny, radical faction emerging from the coffee house debates argued that the use of a spoon was an unnecessary affectation. They claimed the truly authentic way to eat an egg was to simply suck the contents directly from the shell. They were, predictably, ridiculed by both Little-Endians and Big-Endians. A rare moment of unity in the growing divide. The practice never caught on, mostly because it was messy and made a rather unfortunate slurping sound. Standing outside that coffee house window, you feel a growing sense of detachment from the world of the educated and the wealthy. To you, an egg is still just an egg. It's food. It's fuel for a day's hard work. But you can't deny the change in the air. This bizarre, pointless argument, born in the mind of one philosopher nurtured in the haze of the coffee houses, has taken on a life of its own. It's a snowball rolling downhill, getting bigger and faster, and you have a sinking feeling it's about to crash into something very, very important. The snowball doesn't just crash. It gets a royal seal of approval. The whole affair probably would have remained a comical, city-wide obsession, destined to fade away like any other fire. But then, the king got involved. You hear the news from a town crier, a man with a booming voice and a bell, standing in the main square. A crowd gathers, a mix of curious townsfolk, merchants, and errand boys. You pause your own business to listen. After the usual announcements about new taxes and the lost goat, the crier unrolls a fresh scroll, clears his throat, and reads a royal proclamation. The king, in his infinite wisdom and concern for the well-being and moral character of his subjects, has taken notice of the great and vigorous debate concerning the proper consumption of boiled eggs. After careful consideration, the proclamation claims consultation with the nation's finest minds, which probably meant his hunting buddies and his tailor. His Majesty has seen fit to declare his official position. A hush falls over the crowd. This is no longer a philosopher's fancy. This is the law of the land, or at least, the will of the man who makes it. The crier takes a deep breath and bellows henceforth. It is the king's stated preference and the officially sanctioned method within the royal court and all government institutions that an egg shall be cracked from its broader end. A wave of murmurs ripples through the square. The Big-Endians have won, or rather, the king has chosen their side. The proclamation goes on to offer a string of flimsy justifications. It speaks of tradition, stability, and the common sense of the common man. It praises the generous spirit of the Big-Endian method, framing it as an act of patriotic loyalty. The Little-Endian method, by implication, is cast as foreign, overly intellectual, and vaguely subversive. You look around at the faces in the crowd. You see confusion, amusement, and, on some faces, a new, hard set to their jaws. The merchants who had loudly proclaimed themselves Big-Endians are now puffing out their chests, looking smug. Those who had fancied themselves part of the intellectual Little-Endian elite are suddenly quiet, their expressions guarded. Why would the king do this? Why would the most powerful man in the kingdom weigh in on something so trivial? You, a common person, can only guess. But the men in the coffee houses and the political salons have their theories. Some say it's as simple. Petit, the king, a man known more for his appetite than his intellect, apparently had a personal rivalry with Drive, Fibble, who had once made a snide remark about the monarch's grasp of Latin. This was his way of getting revenge, humiliating the philosopher on a national stage. A more cynical, and probably more accurate, theory begins to circulate. The king, it's whispered, is facing challenges to his authority. There are factions at court, discontent in the provinces, and a parliament that is growing increasingly bold. He needs a way to distract the populace and, more importantly, a way to re-identify his loyal followers. He couldn't care less about eggs. The egg is just a symbol, a meaningless banner that he can force everyone to salute. By turning the Big-Endian method into a test of loyalty, he creates a simple, visible way to separate friend from foe. Are you with the king? Then you cracked your egg at the big end. It's that simple. This is a classic political maneuver, and historians still debate whether the king stumbled into it, or if it was a stroke of calculated genius. By elevating a meaningless issue, A ruler can often divert attention from real problems like poverty or corruption, and force people into simplistic verses. Them counts. The egg was the perfect tool. The immediate effect is a chilling of the public debate. The witty coffee-house arguments are replaced by nervous whispers. To publicly declare yourself a Little-Endian is no longer a quirky intellectual stance. It's now an act of defiance against the crown. It's like saying you prefer the king's rival, or that you think his new tax is unfair. The joke has curdled. You walk away from the square feeling deeply uneasy. The king's proclamation has changed everything. It has drawn a line through every kitchen in the kingdom. That simple, warm egg sitting on your breakfast table tomorrow morning is no longer just a meal. It's a political statement. And as you head home, a quiet, nagging question forms in your mind. A question you never thought you'd have to ask yourself: how will you crack your egg tomorrow? And what will it mean when you do? With the king's decree echoing through the land, the debate enters a new, far more pretentious phase. It's no longer enough to have an opinion. You must now have a scientific basis for it. The scientists of the day, or as they were more commonly known, natural philosophers, are summoned to lend their intellectual weight to the cause, and they dive in with gusto. Suddenly, learned men from the Royal Society and other academic circles are publishing papers, not on astronomy or botany, but on the structural and theological implications of the avian ovum. These are not flimsy pamphlets like Dry Thippoles' original work. These are serious, dense documents, filled with Latin phrases, complex diagrams, and appeals to ancient authorities. You might see one of these papers, perhaps displayed in the window of a print shop. It's filled with illustrations that look incredibly technical and impressive. There's a cross-minus section of an egg, meticulously labeled. The shell is no longer just a shell. It is the JSTOR, comprised of multiple membranae. The yolk is the vitellus, and the little white squiggly bit, the chalazio, is dramatically labeled the fun icolus morally is, a mororo, which, according to one Big-Endian scholar, anchors the yolk to the foundation of stability. The Big-Endian scientists, eager to curry favor with the king, produce a flurry of research. One paper argues that the broader base of the egg is structurally superior, a natural arch designed by the creator to withstand pressure, thus making it the logical point of entry. It includes pages of complex calculations, attempting to prove that tapping the little end sends disharmonious vibrations through the yolk. Another focuses on the air sac at the big end. Far from being Fipple's moral vacuum, they now declare it to be the Camera Ariae, the celestial chamber where the spirit of the chick first stirs. Opening the egg here, they argue, is an act of liberation, a release of potential. Not to be silenced, the Little-Endians fight back from the fringes, publishing their own anonymous or foreign printed treatises. They, too, employ the language of science. A brave naturalist, risking royal displeasure, dissects 100 eggs and publishes his findings, claiming with some creative data manipulation that the shell is demonstrably thinner at the pointed end, proving it is the intended access point. He calls it the Porta Honoris, the Gate of Honor. Another Little-Endian argument takes a more medical turn. One physician writes a widely, if secretly, circulated text claiming that consuming an egg from the big end can lead to an imbalance of the bodily humors. Opening the egg from the brute base, he warns, introduces an excess of phlegmatic humor into the digestive system, leading to sluggishness, melancholy, and a general lack of moral fiber. A proper Little-Endian breakfast, conversely, promotes a sanguine temperament, encouraging wit and vigor. It's quackery, of course, but it's quackery dressed up in the most authoritative medical language of the day. This entire chapter of the debate is a wonderful example of what we now call confirmation bias. No one was actually conducting impartial research. They had already decided which side they were on or which side it was politically safest to be on, and then they simply cherry-minus picked evidence, invented jargon, and twisted logic to fit their preconceived conclusions. Historians are still unpicking these texts, and there's a running debate about whether any of these natural philosophers actually believed their own arguments, or if it was all a cynical game to gain patronage and prestige. For you, this new scientific front is completely bewildering. You hear these grand minors sounding terms teste, vitellus, camera harrier bandied about by people in the market and the tavern. It's all deeply impressive and utterly meaningless. It's designed to make ordinary people feel ignorant, to suggest that the simple act of eating breakfast is a complex science that must be left to experts. You watch as your neighbor, the one who had tentatively adopted the Little-Endian method, now looks at her eggs with a new anxiety. She used to worry about being unfashionable. Now she worries she is being unscientific. She has heard that cracking the big end is better for the humors. The king's word was one thing, but the word of science feels so much more absolute, so much more intimidating. The debate is no longer about philosophy or politics. It has cloaked itself in the mantle of objective truth, making it more powerful and more dangerous than ever before. The egg on your table is now not just a political symbol, but a scientific specimen, and you, its consumer, are an unwitting participant in a grand and utterly ridiculous experiment. The pressure that began in the king's court and the halls of science now seeps down into the very cobblestones of your street. The debate is no longer an abstract concept. It's a daily reality, a question that hangs in the air of every social interaction. It has become a tribal marker, as clear and as defining as the clothes you wear or the church you attend. The question is now blunt and direct. You hear it everywhere. Children in the streets stop their games to demand of each other, are you a little -end or a big -end? In the alehouse, before a man even offers to buy you a drink, he might lean in undusk with a conspiratorial air. So, which end for you? The answer determines whether you are a friend or a stranger, a comrade or a suspect. Your own life becomes a minefield of small, fraught decisions. When you visit your sister, her husband offers you a boiled egg. You see him watch you as you take it. He is a staunch Big-Endian, a man who prides himself on his loyalty and common sense. You know that how you open this egg will be seen as a judgment on him, on his household, on his values. Do you conform to his way to keep the pace, swallowing your perhaps non-existent principles along with your breakfast? Or do you make a point, potentially starting a family squabble that could last for years? The simple act of accepting hospitality has become a test of allegiance. The social landscape is redrawn along these absurd lines. Families are divided. Friendships of 20 years are strained because one friend finds the other's breakfast habits to be a sign of moral decay or, worse, intellectual pretension. You hear stories, likely exaggerated but rooted in truth, of a romance broken off because the young man discovered his intended bride was from a staunch Little-Endian family. I could not. He was quoted as saying, "Bring such chaotic thinking into my lineage." This forced choice creates a strange kind of social performance. People begin to adopt the mannerisms they believe are associated with their chosen faction. The Big-Endians, taking that cue from the king, affect a blah, no minus nonsense demeanor. They might crack their eggs with an exaggerated thump on the table, a display of their earthy pragmatism. The Little-Endians, now a beleaguered minority, become more subtle. They might produce a special, small, pointed knife for the task, performing the first incision with a quiet, deliberate precision that signals their intellectual refinement. Historians are still debating the extent to which these divisions mapped onto pre-existing social tensions. Was the egg debate merely a proxy war for deeper conflicts between royalists and parliamentarians, between city merchants and rural gentry, between different religious sects? Or did this nonsensical issue create entirely new fault lines all on its own? The most likely answer is a messy combination of both. The egg controversy was like a dye dropped into water, revealing the invisible currents and eddies that were already there. One of the most curious side effects of this period is what linguists call semantic bleaching. The terms Big-Endian and Little-Endian start to lose their original meaning. You might hear someone describe a wobbly cart wheel as having a Big-Endian sort of problem, meaning it's unstable. Or a clever new poem might be praised for its Little-Endian wit. The egg itself becomes almost irrelevant. The labels are what matter. You find yourself navigating this new world with a growing weariness. You try to avoid the topic altogether, mumbling non-committal lie winners. But silence is also a stance, one that draws suspicion from both sides. They see you as shifty, unprincipled. The pressure to declare yourself is immense. It comes from your guilt, from your neighbors, from the man who sells you bread. One morning, you are eating your own breakfast in the privacy of your small home. You have an egg. You hold it in your hand. You look at the big end. You look at the little end. For the first time, you are paralyzed by this simple choice. It feels heavy, freighted with a meaning it should not have. Cracking it one way feels like a betrayal of what? You're not even sure. Cracking it the other feels like a capitulation. The joy of a simple meal is gone, replaced by anxiety. The conflict is no longer out there in the city. It's right here, in your hand, and the simple, quiet life you once knew feels like a distant memory. Where there is conflict, there is commerce, and the great egg debate, for all its philosophical posturing, quickly becomes a golden opportunity for the nation's entrepreneurs. The merchants, craftsmen, and tinkers, who couldn't care less about celestial points or moral vacuums, see a burgeoning new market, and they rush to monetize the madness. The first and most obvious product is the egg cup. Before the conflict, an egg cup was a simple, functional object, a small wooden or ceramic cup designed to hold an egg upright. But now, it becomes a statement piece, a declaration of allegiance that sits right on your breakfast table. You start to see them appear in the market stalls and in the windows of potters' shops. Big-Endian egg cups are designed for stability. They are squat, heavy, with a wide, solid base. They are often made of dark, earthy stone pottery or thick, heavy turned wood. Some are decorated with patriotic symbols, the king's crest, the lion, or an oak leaf subtly linking the Big-Endian choice with national pride. They are advertised with slogans like, the king's cup for the king's egg. The Little-Endian models, by contrast, are all about elegance and refinement. They are often taller, more slender, with delicate, fruited designs, almost like a miniature chalice. They are made from finer materials, imported porcelain if you were wealthy, or tin glazed earthenware painted with delicate blue flowers. These cups are designed to present the egg, with its celestial point held aloft, a tiny monument to reason. They appeal to the sense of intellectual superiority that the Little-Endians, now a persecuted minority, cling to so dearly. Then come the spoons. Oh, the spoons. A whole new industry of specialized ovoid excavation implements springs up. For the Big-Endians, spoon makers create implements with broad, shovel-like bowls, perfect for generous, hearty scooping. The handles are thick and sturdy, designed for a firm, manly grip. The Little-Endian spoons are a different species altogether. They are smaller, more delicate, with pointed tips designed for surgical entry. Some even have a tiny, sharp finial on the handle, a built and tapper for making the initial precise crack at the little end. Owning one of these is a discreet way of signaling your sympathies without having to say a word. This new industry creates its own bizarre ecosystem. You see advertisements, woodcuts pasted on city walls, showing a happy, prosperous looking family sitting down to breakfast. They are all smile, using their matching set of Royal Foundation Big-Endian egg cups, their faces glowing with civic virtue. Another ad, circulated more discreetly, shows a lone, thoughtful scholar in his study, gently tapping his egg with a philosopher's spoon, the very picture of intellectual serenity. Historians are still debating whether this commercialization helped fuel the conflict or simply capitalized on it. It's a chicken and egg situation, if you'll pardon the expression. Did the availability of these products make people feel more entrenched in their chosen camps? Or was the demand already there, just waiting for a savvy merchant to meet it? The truth is likely that it was a feedback loop. The products reinforced the identities, and the identities created a demand for the products. A fascinating and slightly absurd side minus hustle that pops up is the exhorter. These are individuals, often with a flair for the dramatic, who set up stalls in the market claiming they can, for a small fee, identify the true nature of any given egg. They will hold it up, squint at it, weigh it in their palm, and then declare it a decidedly big-endian egg. So, full of robust character, or a classic little-endian specimen, destined for a refined palate. It's pure theatre. Of course every egg has a big end and a little end, but people pay for the reassurance. It's a small price to pay to feel that your breakfast choice is cosmically ordained. For you, this commercial frenzy adds another layer of absurdity to the whole situation. The other day, you saw your neighbor polishing his new big-endian egg cup with a ridiculous amount of pride. It's just a cup, but, to him, it's a symbol of his identity, a tangible piece of his loyalty. You see the subtle pressure to purchase, to own the correct equipment for your breakfast, to use a simple, unadorned cup from the before times now seems rustic, even ignorant. The great debate has moved beyond the mind and into the marketplace. It's no longer just what you think, it's what you own. And in your simple home, with your plain wooden cup and your old horn spoon, you feel increasingly out of step with the times. Just when you think the situation couldn't possibly get any more ridiculous, the great egg debate spills over the borders and becomes an instrument of international politics. What was once a domestic squabble is now a matter for ambassadors and foreign ministers. The choice of how to crack an egg becomes a form of diplomatic signaling, as subtle as a raised eyebrow and as potent as a slammed door. The kingdom's primary rival is the powerful nation across the sea. The two countries have a long and storied history of competition, marked by trade disputes, colonial skirmishes, and a general sense of mutual suspicion. For years, diplomats have navigated these treacherous waters with carefully worded treaties and strategic alliances. Now, they have a new, wonderfully petty tool in their arsenal, the breakfast table. The news arrives in the form of letters and travelers' reports, which are then dissected and debated in the coffee houses, the ones that still tolerate open discussion. At least, the king of the rival nation, a shrewd and cunning monarch, sees a golden opportunity. Hearing that your king has officially endorsed the big-endian method, he makes a very public, very pointed declaration at a grand state banquet, attended by ambassadors from across the continent. He announces that his own kingdom, a bastion of enlightenment and forward-minded thinking, will henceforth and forever be a little-endian nation. The gesture is a masterpiece of political theater. He doesn't need to insult your king directly. He doesn't need to threaten war. He just needs to crack his egg at the opposite end. The message is clear: you are backward, traditionalist, and boorish. We are progressive, rational, and sophisticated. Every crack of a little-endian eggshell in his court is a tiny, symbolic blow against your kingdom's prestige. The diplomatic court crumbles to a death. An ambassador's breakfast becomes a high-stakes performance. When your kingdom's envoy attends a breakfast meeting in the rival nation's capital, he is served a boiled egg. All eyes are on him. Does he adhere to his own king's big-endian decree, thereby insulting his hosts in a deeply personal, culinary way? Or does he adopt their little-endian custom to show goodwill, an act that would be reported back home as a sign of weakness, even treason? There are whispers of one unfortunate diplomat who, paralyzed by indecision, simply claimed to have lost his appetite. He was recalled within a month. The absurdity trickles down to every level of international interaction. Merchants trading abroad find that their breakfast habits are scrutinized. A big-endian raider in a little-endian port might find his negotiations inexplicably stalled, his paperwork lost, his meetings endlessly postponed. He is, after all, a representative of a barbaric food culture. Historians still argue about the real-world impact of this eggshell diplomacy. Was it merely a silly sideshow, or did it have tangible consequences? Some scholars maintain that the egg issue exacerbated existing tensions, providing a constant, low-level irritant that made genuine diplomatic progress on more serious matters like border disputes or trade tariffs all the more difficult. How can you trust a man on the subject of colonial boundaries when you can't even agree on the fundamental principles of breakfast? One of the strangest pieces of apocrypha from this period is the story of the neutral egg. A small, neutral principality, caught between the two great powers, found itself in an impossible position. To choose a side in the egg debate would be to risk offending one of its powerful neighbors. The prince of this nation, a man celebrated for his diplomatic ingenuity, is said to have issued a decree that in his lands, eggs would not be served boiled at all. They would only be served scrambled, fried, or in omelettes, thus neatly sidestepping the entire controversy. This is likely just a folk tale, but it perfectly captures the desperation of the time. Back home, this for an entanglement pours fuel on the domestic fire. The Little-Endians, once just a group of contrarian intellectuals, are now painted with the broad brush of treason. They are foreign sympathizers, their breakfast choice a sign of disloyalty to the king and country. Propaganda broadsheets appear showing the rival king, caricatured with a grotesquely pointed head, offering a tiny egg to a crowd of fawning Little-Endians from your own nation. You feel the world shrinking. The geopolitical struggles of kings and empires have found their way into your kitchen. The simple egg in its simple cup is now an avatar for national pride, diplomatic tension, and the ever-present threat of the other. The rivalry with the nation across the sea was always a fact of life, a distant trumble of drums. But now, you are expected to participate in it every morning, to fight a tiny battle in a grand war, one spoonful at a time. In the shadow of the two great warring factions, a third, more radical group begins to emerge. They are neither Big-Endian nor Little-Endian. They are the centrists, the compromiser-ish, the revolutionaries of the breakfast table. They are the secret society of the middle-crackers. Their philosophy is simple, elegant, and, in the context of the times, utterly heretical. They argue that both the Big-Endians and Little-Endians are trapped in a false dichotomy. Both are obsessed with the poles of the egg, with notions of superiority and inferiority. The true power, the middle-crackers whisper, lies in rejecting this polarity altogether. The proper way to open an egg, they claim, is to give it a sharp wrap right around its equator, its fleshy middle, and then gently pry the two halves apart. This is not just a culinary preference, it's a profound philosophical and political statement. To crack an egg in the middle is to reject the king's arbitrary authority and the rebel's pretentious intellectualism in one single evolutionary act. It is a declaration of independence. It represents balance, equity, and a rejection of extremist thinking. Some of the more mystically inclined members even call it the equatorial compromise, suggesting it aligns the egg with the harmonious balance of the planet itself. Because their position is an affront to both established camps, the middle-crackers are forced to operate in secret. They are a true underground movement. They cannot meet in coffee houses or debate openly in public squares. To do so would be to invite scorn and persecution from all sides. The Big-Endians see them as chaotic anarchists, unwilling to respect tradition and order. The Little-Endians view them as unprincipled brutes, lacking the finesse and rational thought to find the correct point. So, they meet in secret, in clandestine locations, the back rooms of taverns, dusty attics, remote barns late at night. You might stumble upon their existence by accident. Perhaps you overhear a coded phrase between two men at the market. One says, "The horizon is long," and the other replies, "But the belt is wide." It means nothing to you, but it is a password, a sign of mutual recognition. Their symbol, whispered about but rarely seen, is two linked circles, representing the two halves of a perfectly cracked eggshell. They have secret handshakes and initiation rites. To join, a new member must, in front of the assembled group, take an egg and, with a single, confident tap of a spoon, crack it perfectly around its middle. The historical evidence for the middle-minus crackers is, by its very nature, sparse and difficult to verify. Secret societies don't tend to keep detailed minutes. Much of what we know comes from the court records of those who were caught and prosecuted, or from the penny, denunciatory pamphlets published by the mainstream factions. Historians are still trying to determine if they were a genuine, organized movement or just a collection of disparate, like-minded individuals who were retroactively labeled as a group by their enemies. This academic debate about their structure and influence continues to this day. One of the most fascinating and possibly apocryphal tales associated with them is the invention of the egg topper, a device we might recognize today. The story goes that a clever middle-minus cracker, a watchmaker by trade, created a small, circular metal device with tiny blades on the inside. You place it on top of the egg, squeeze the handles, and it would neatly slice the top off, creating a perfect, flat opening, a sort of mobile, mechanical form of the equatorial compromise. This allowed a member to practice their philosophy without the tail-stale mess of a sideways crack. Though possession of such a device was considered highly seditious, you become aware of this third way through hushed rumors. A friend might pull you aside and, after looking over both shoulders, confess that he's grown weary of the whole and minus ISD debate. He might then, with a nervous tremor in his hands, show you his technique, the quick tap against the side of his mouth, the gentle separation of the shell. He explains the logic, the simple, beautiful, dangerous logic of the middle way. Suddenly, the world is even more complicated. There are not two tribes, but three, and this third tribe is, in many ways, the most threatening to the established order. They don't just want to win the argument. They want to render the argument itself obsolete. They are the true heretic. Their existence proves that the entire conflict is built on a fragile, binary premise. By simply offering a third option, they expose the absurdity of the other two. For the powers that be, this is the most dangerous idea of all. And you, now aware of this secret, must carry the knowledge like a hot coal, knowing that even the way you hold your spoon could be interpreted as a sign of radical, revolutionary sympathies. As the conflict deepens, it inevitably draws in the most solemn and serious arbiters of all the theologians. If the natural philosophers had tried to claim the egg for science, the men of the cloth would now attempt to claim it for God. The question of how to crack an egg is elevated from a matter of politics and science to one of eternal salvation. The tipping point is a sermon delivered by the Archbishop himself, a man whose stern visage and unwavering loyalty to the king are known throughout the land. From his grand pulpit, he thunders against the heresy of the little end. He frames the debate in stark, biblical terms. The big end, he proclaims, represents the broadened righteous path spoken of in Scripture, accessible to all faithful subjects. The air sac within is not a void, but a holy breath, a divine space blessed by the Creator. To open an egg from this end is to align oneself with God's own design for the world and, not coincidentally, with the king's. Conversely, the little end is cast as the needle's eye of pride, a narrow, difficult path, chosen only by the arrogant and the vain who believe their own intellect is superior to divine simplicity. Dr. Phipones' celestial point is reframed as a pinnacle of vanity, and the entire Little-Endian philosophy is condemned as a form of intellectual pride, one of the deadliest of the seven sins. This sermon opens the floodgates. Soon, clerics across the kingdom are echoing the Archbishop's line, eager to demonstrate their loyalty. The Sunday service, once a place for spiritual reflection, becomes another front in the egg war. You find yourself sitting on a hard wooden pew, listening to your local vicar spend half an hour drawing complex, convoluted allegories between the story of Cain and Abel and the moral failings of the Little-Endians. Of course, the theological battle cannot be entirely one-sided. Exiled Little-Endian sympathizers and theologians in the rival Little-Endian nation begin publishing their own religious tracts. They argue that the little end represents the focused, singular nature of true faith. They compare the act of cracking the narrow point to the story of David felling Goliath with a single, while minus aimed stone a triumph of precision and faith over brute force. They find scriptural passages that they claim, through creative interpretation, allude to the righteousness of points, spires, and aspiring forms. The debate reaches its absurd zenith with the convening of a special religious council in the neutral city-state of Geneva, a place known for its stern theological debates. The Geneva Ag Synod is called, ostensibly, to settle the matter once and for all. For 2 weeks, dozens of the continent's most learned theologians, representing both Big-Endian and Little-Endian viewpoints, gather in a great, cold stone hall. The records of the Synod, some of which survive to this day, are a masterclass in pedantic absurdity. Theologians armed with texts in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew argue with ferocious intensity. They debate whether the egg consumed at the Last Supper was cracked from the big or little end. They analyze passages from Genesis, trying to determine the ovoid properties of the forbidden fruit. One scholar presents a 3-100-page dissertation, arguing that the shape of a bishop's mitre is theological proof of the sanctity of the little end. A Big-Endian retorts that the dome of a cathedral proves the holiness of the broad base. Historians are still debating the true purpose of the Geneva Synod. Was it a genuine, if misguided, attempt to find theological truth, or was it pure political theatre, a way for the different factions to project their power and influence on an international stage? The fact that the Synod ultimately failed to reach any conclusion, dissolving into bitter accusations and mutual excommunications, suggests the latter, one of the more obscure and frankly bizarre arguments to come out of the Synod was the double-yoke heresy. One theologian claimed that the discovery of a double-yoked egg was a divine omen, but what it signified was hotly contested. The Big-Endians claimed it was a sign of God's abundant generosity. Reinforcing their position, the Little-Endians argued it represented a dangerous duality, a warning against the wide path that leads to ruin. The debate over the double-yoke question alone took up 3 full days of the Synod's time. For you, listening to the vicar's sermons and hearing the second-hand reports from Geneva, this new religious dimension is the most unsettling of all. It's one thing for the king to issue a decree, or for scientists to argue with jargon. But when the man standing at the pulpit tells you that your breakfast choice could have implications for your immortal soul, the pressure becomes immense. The egg is no longer just food, or a political symbol, or a scientific specimen. It is now a test of faith. The fear of being wrong is no longer about social ostracism. It's about eternal damnation, and that is a very heavy weight to place on a simple, fragile eggshell. With the conflict now raging on philosophical, political, scientific, and theological fronts, it was only a matter of time before it conquered the final realm of human endeavor, the arts. The great egg debate becomes the unlikely muse for an entire generation of poets, painters, and composers who turn their creative energies to celebrating their chosen side of the argument. Art, by its nature, becomes a powerful new form of propaganda. A grand history painting is commissioned by a wealthy Big-Endian nobleman. It hangs in his great hall for all to see. The painting depicts a romanticized version of the king's proclamation, with the monarch standing bathed in a heavenly golden light, pointing decisively towards a large, robust-looking egg. Around him, loyal subjects weep with joy, their faces full of patriotic fervor. In the gloomy corners of the painting, you can just make out a few shadowy, hook-nosed figures, clearly Little-Endian sympathizers, scurrying away like rats. It's not subtle, but it's effective. In response, Little-Endian artists, often working in secret or in exile, create their own works. Small, intimate still-life paintings become a popular medium for dissent. You might see one in the home of a wealthy merchant with Little-Endian leanings. The painting would be simple as single, perfect egg resting in a delicate porcelain cup, its celestial point aimed towards a sliver of light coming from a window. Beside it might lie a book of philosophy and a single, elegant quill pen. The message is one of quiet, intellectual resistance, a celebration of refinement in a world of brute force. Music, too, is weaponized. The royal composer, a man whose salary depends on pleasing the king, debuts a new grand ballet called The Triumph of the Foundation. It's a lavish, 3-act spectacle. The lead male dancer, representing the Big-Endian principle, is strong and athletic, his movements grounded and powerful. He battles a wicked sorcerer, the villainous Little-End, who is portrayed by a dancer who moves with jerky, unsettlingly sharp gestures. In the triumphant final act, the Big-Endian hero cracks a giant prop egg on stage from the big end, of course, and the corps de ballet, dressed as happy peasants, erupts in joyful, folk-inspired dances. Meanwhile, in the clandestine salons of the Little-Endians, a new sonata for the viola da gambia harpsichord is passed around in manuscript form. It's called Sonata in E-G major. It is a complex, intricate piece of music, full of soaring, high-pitched melodies and clever counterpoint. Its admirers praise its rational structure and aspirational quality, a clear musical metaphor for the Little-Endian worldview. To be caught with a copy of the sheet music could be grounds for suspicion. Even popular culture is saturated with the debate. The puppeteers at the annual fair put on shows for the common folk. In the Big-Endian version, the hero, a jolly, fat fellow named Johnny Broadbottom, outwits the skinny, pretentious villain, Professor Pointy. In the Little-Endian puppet shows, which are often shut down by the authorities, the clever heroine, Lady Prudence, uses her sharp wit and a sharp little knife to get the better of the oafish Sir Brutus. Historians often debate whether this artistic outpouring was a sign of a vibrant culture engaging with the central issue of its time, or a symptom of a society that had lost all sense of proportion. Was the egg ballet a genuine work of art? Or was it just state-sponsored kitsch? The answer, as always, is a matter of perspective. A particularly fascinating and strange artistic artifact from this period is a type of decorative pottery that has come to be known as argument china. These were plates and mugs, popular among the middle classes, that were decorated with scenes from the egg debate. One common design featured two roosters, one plump and one skinny, engaged in a furious cockfight over a single egg. It was a way for a family to show they were engaged with current events. A conversation piece for the dinner table. Some of these pieces are now prized museum exhibits, a testament to how deeply the conflict penetrated the domestic sphere. You see this art all around you, and it reinforces the sense that there is no escape. The paintings in the Guildhall, the songs that children sing in the streets, the plot of the puppet show at the market, they all carry the same message, hammering home the divisions in society. The conflict is no longer just a set of ideas. It has been given a face, a voice, a soundtrack. Art has made the abstract real, turning the ridiculous into something that feels grand, heroic, and dangerously important. And in a world filled with such powerful images and stirring music, it becomes harder and harder to remember that it all started with something as small and simple as an egg. The pressure, which had been social, political, and cultural, now takes on a sharper, more menacing edge. The authorities, spurred on by the king's paranoia and the zeal of loyalist officials, begin to actively police the breakfast table. The egg debate enters its surveillance phase. It starts with the watch, the city's guards, who were once primarily concerned with thieves and drunkards, are now given a new, bizarre directive to be vigilant for signs of culinary sedition. They are encouraged to listen to conversations in taverns, to peek into the windows of coffee houses, and to report any overt displays of Little-Endianism. Your own home, once a private sanctuary, no longer feels entirely safe. You start to worry about your neighbors. Old Mrs. Gable next door, a sweet but notoriously nosy woman, is a fervent Big-Endian. You find yourself being extra careful when you dispose of your breakfast scraps. You crush your eggshells regardless of how you open them into a fine powder before mixing them with the day's ashes, lest you catch a glimpse of a shell fragment that looks suspiciously pointed. A casual glance from her over the back fence now feels like an interrogation. The fear of being reported, even for something so trivial, is palpable. A whisper from a neighbor to a member of the watch could lead to a friendly visit. 2 guards might knock on your door one evening, their expressions unreadable. They've had a report, they might say, of unusual breakfast practices at this address. They might ask to see your egg cups, your spoons. Possession of the wrong kind of paraphernalia becomes a liability. That elegant, slender Little-Endian spoon you might have bought during the early, more fashionable days of the debate is now a piece of incriminating evidence. You have to make a choice. Do you hide it away at the bottom of a chest, or do you get rid of it altogether? Perhaps by dropping it into the river in the dead of night. People start to perform a kind of culinary cleansing of their homes, making sure their kitchens display only the proper state-sanctioned Big-Endian equipment. This leads to a fascinating and somewhat comical game of cat and mouse. The Little-Endians, driven by conviction or simple stubbornness, develop ways to practice their preference in secret. Some families adopt a 2 spoon system, a set of perfectly legal Big-Endian spoons for display and for use when guests are present, and a second, hidden set of sharp, pointed Little-Endian spoons for private, family-only meals. One of the most peculiar legends from this time is the false bottomed egg cup. This was supposedly a clever invention. A Big-Endian style cup, squat and stable, but with a removable inner piece. When the piece was in place, it could hold an egg for a proper Little-Endian cracking. When removed, it became a standard Big-Endian cup. Whether such an object ever truly existed is a point of contention among historians of material culture. Some see it as a hopeful myth of resistance, while others believe a few prototypes might have been made by dissident craftsmen. The situation escalates when the authorities begin to employ professional informers. These are shadowy individuals who, for a few coins, will happily report on the breakfast habits of their friends and colleagues. The social fabric begins to fray. Trust evaporates. You look at the man you shared a workbench with for 10 years and wonder, could he be an informer? Would he sell you out for the price of a few pints of ale? The paranoia becomes all-consuming. An innocent remark can be twisted into something sinister. You might casually say, "This point is sharp," while mending a tool, and then immediately freeze, hoping no one overheard and misinterpreted your comment as a coded endorsement of the Little-Endian cause. Humor drains from the situation, replaced by a low-grade, constant anxiety. You feel the walls closing in. The simple, private sphere of your life is being invaded. The state is no longer content to simply tell you what to think. It now wants to know what you do in the privacy of your own kitchen. The line between public and private has been erased. The egg, that most humble of foods, has become a tool of social control, a way for the state to peer into your home and your heart. And the simple act of preparing a meal now requires a level of caution and secrecy worthy of a conspirator planning to overthrow the government. The absurdity reaches its glittering, suffocating peak at a grand royal banquet. This isn't a meal. It's a meticulously choreographed display of power and loyalty. You can imagine the scene: a cavernous hall, walls draped in heavy tapestries, the air thick with the scent of beeswax candles and expensive perfume. Hundreds of nobles and dignitaries are in attendance, their silks and velvets rustling, their jewels glinting in the light of a dozen chandeliers. They are all here to see and be seen, and most importantly, to publicly affirm their allegiance to the king. After a succession of elaborate courses, peacock pies, jelly deals, mountains of roasted meat, a hush falls over the hall. A team of footmen in immaculate livery marches in, bearing silver platters. On each platter, nestled in beds of pristine linen, are boiled eggs, one for every guest. This is the moment everyone has been waiting for. This is the political and theological climax of the evening. Each guest is presented with a single egg in a heavy, gilded, officially sanctioned Big-Endian cup. The king, seated at the high table, surveys the room with a look of grim satisfaction. He picks up his solid gold spoon. Across the hall, hundreds of other spoons are lifted in unison. The silence is absolute. broken only by the crackle of the great fires in the hearths. Everyone is waiting for the royal tear, the signal to commence the ritual of communal, state-sanctioned cracking. And then, a small, clear voice cuts through the tension. Father, the voice belongs to the king's youngest child, a boy of about 7, perched uncomfortably on a tall chair beside the queen. Royal children of this era were often treated as miniature adults, their lives strictly governed by tutors and courtiers, and their public appearances were rare and highly rehearsed. Spontaneous questions were not on the agenda. The king turns, slightly annoyed by the interruption. Yes, Theodore. The prince is holding his spoon, but he's looking at his egg with an expression of genuine, childish puzzlement. He asks, his voice carrying clearly in the silent hall, Your Majesty, if we were having scrambled eggs, which end would be the big end then? For a solid 5 seconds, there is no sound at all. It is a silence so deep and so profound that you could hear a feather fall. 100 lords, ladies, bishops, and generals are frozen in place, their spoons hovering over their eggs. The question, in its devastating, simple logic, has short-circuited the entire affair. It has taken the vast, complex, terrifying edifice of philosophy, politics, science, and theology that has been built around the egg, and it has poked a hole in it with a child's pinprick of common sense. The question implies that this universal, moral principle is utterly dependent on a single method of preparation, exposing its situational, and therefore, fundamental, absurdity. The king's face, for a fleeting moment, is a mask of pure, psych-jawed astonishment. Then, his political instincts kick in. He forces a booming laugh. A silly question. My boy, we are not having scrambled eggs. We are having proper eggs, for proper subject. A wave of nervous, sycophantic laughter ripples through the hall as the courtiers rush to follow their king's lead. The moment is papered over. The king gives his egg a firm, decisive tap on its broad base. Hundreds of other taps follow in a ragged, slightly minus to minus late chorus. The meal continues, but the spell is broken. The story of the prince's scrambled question leaks out of the palace walls almost immediately, passed from footman to stable boy, from Lady Minus and Minus waiting to merchant's wife. It becomes the most popular whispered joke in the kingdom. It's a safe way to mock the establishment, because who could punish you for repeating the innocent question of a child? To this day, historians debate whether the incident of the prince's question actually happened as described. No official court record mentions it, for obvious reasons. Is it an apocryphal story, a piece of folklore created later by a wary populace to give a neat, satisfying beginning to the end of the madness? Or did a 7-year-old boy, bored at a state dinner, truly deal the first fatal blow to the great egg debate? We may never know for certain. What is certain is that something shifted after that night. The laughter in the streets began to change. People were no longer just laughing at the caricatures in the puppet shows. They were laughing at the very premise of the conflict itself. The fear hadn't vanished, but it was now tinged with a new, powerful, and liberating sense of the ridiculous. A child had pointed out that the emperor was wearing no clothes, and even though everyone pretended not to have noticed, the image, once seen, could not be unseen. The shift in public sentiment, ignited by a child's innocent question, soon manifests in the most public and humiliating way possible. The courtroom, the great egg debate, in its dying throes, gives rise to a series of bizarre and utterly farcical legal proceedings, where innocent citizens find themselves on trial for culinary treason and other equally absurd offenses. Imagine yourself in the public gallery of the local courthouse. It's a stuffy, overcrowded room, smelling of unwashed bodies and nervous sweat. The judge, a stern minus-faced man in a heavy wig, looks utterly exhausted by the absurdity of the cases brought before him. The first case you witness is that of Martha, a simple baker's wife. She stands accused of conspiracy to undermine the royal palate, a charge that sounds as ridiculous as it is vaguely menacing. The prosecution, a pompous lawyer who clearly believes he is performing a great service to the crown, presents his evidence, He holds up a cracked eggshell, meticulously preserved. Your Honor, members of the jury, he intones. This is Exhibit A. Observe the clean, precise break, the undeniable evidence that this egg was opened from the narrow end. A clear and deliberate defiance of His Majesty's sacred decree. He then calls a witness, a disgruntled former employee of Martha's, who testifies that he saw her habitually and without remorse crack eggs from the little end when preparing pastries for sale. The implications are clear. She was trying to spread Little-Endian sedition through her baked goods. Martha, terrified, protests that she simply cracks eggs the way her grandmother taught her, from whichever end is most convenient. But convenience, in these times, is no defense against fanaticism. The judge, tired but bound by the prevailing political winds, grimly instructs the jury. The most infamous of these trials is the Great Kitchen Conspiracy, where several prominent chefs from the city's finest taverns are arrested. They are accused of a heinous plot serving compromised meals to unsuspecting patrons. One chef, a portly, jovial man named Master Giles, is specifically charged with preparing omelets using eggs that were, according to the prosecution, conceptually opened from the little end. How one can conceptually open an egg from a specific end for a scrambled dish is never fully explained. But it doesn't matter. The absurdity has reached such a pitch that logic has abandoned the courtroom entirely. Historians are still arguing about the true purpose of these trials. Were they genuine attempts to enforce the king's decree, no matter how ridiculous? Or were they cynical show trials, designed to instill fear and provide an outlet for the public's frustration, diverting attention from real political discontent? It's likely a bit of both. The king's government needed to demonstrate its unwavering commitment to the Big-Endian cause, while also putting on a public spectacle to reinforce obedience. A bizarre side effect of these trials was the emergence of egg miners forensic experts. These were usually former natural philosophers or even butchers, who would be called to testify on the precise nature of an eggshell fracture. They would use magnifying glasses and small tools, offering elaborate theories on stress points, cleavage planes, and impact angles, all to prove or disprove how an egg had been opened. Their testimony, often full of impressive but ultimately meaningless jargon, further contributed to the surreal atmosphere of the courtroom. Academics still pore over the transcripts of these trials, trying to discern if there was any actual scientific basis to these expert opinions. Most agree there was none. You leave the courthouse feeling a mix of outrage and profound weariness. This is what it has come to. People's lives, their livelihoods, are being ruined over the most trivial of matters. The trials are a stark reminder that even when the absurdity is painfully obvious, the machinery of state power, once set in motion, is incredibly difficult to stop. The laughter that began with the prince's question now carries a bitter edge. People still tell jokes about the egg trials, but they are dark jokes, tinged with fear. You see Master Giles, the chef, after he is released from prison, his spirit visibly broken. He no longer cracks eggs at all. He leaves that task to his apprentice, his hands trembling as he simply watches the young man prepare the meal. The public show trials might have achieved their goal of enforcing compliance, but they have also revealed the true, chilling cost of a king's petty whim, and you realize, with a heavy heart, that the true damage of this pointless debate extends far beyond a broken eggshell. In a desperate attempt to find common ground, or perhaps just to inject some much needed gravitas into the increasingly farcical debate, some scholars turn to history. If modern reason and divine revelation couldn't settle the egg question, surely the wisdom of the ancients could. The search for the original and correct way to eat an egg leads to a peculiar academic frenzy and a curious examination of forgotten texts. You might hear about this new academic quest from a particularly enthusiastic, if slightly unhinged, antiquarian in a dusty bookshop. He breathlessly explains how he's discovered a passage in a long-lost Roman agricultural treatise that describes, in excruciating detail, how patricians prepared their morning meals. Behold, he might exclaim, holding up a fragile, worm-eaten manuscript. The answer lies in the practices of antiquity. The antiquarians and classical scholars begin poring over every available ancient text. They examine not just culinary guides, but philosophical treatises, medical texts, and even epic poems, searching for any mention of eggs and their consumption. Did Homer's heroes crack their eggs from the big end before battle? Did Caesar favor the small end with his morning gruel? The problem, of course, is that the ancients, bless their common minus and souls, didn't seem to care which end of an egg you cracked. They were far more interested in whether the egg was fresh, or how to cook it without burning the inside. Any mention of eggs is usually brief and functional. This lack of explicit evidence doesn't deter the determined scholars. Instead, they resort to ever more imaginative and increasingly ludicrous interpretations. A Little-Endian scholar might point to a Roman fresco depicting a feast, noting that a single whole egg appears to be resting in a dish with its pointed end subtly elevated. A clear preference, he would declare, ignoring the fact that the artist probably just drew it that way to make it look nicer. Conversely, a Big-Endian classicist might argue that the very architecture of Roman structures their grand, wide arches and stable foundations demonstrates an inherent Big-Endian philosophy in their society. It is the spirit of Rome itself, they would grandly announce, connecting a culinary habit to an entire civilization's engineering principles. One of the most peculiar discoveries, or rather, misinterpretations from this period revolves around the consumption of goose eggs. Goose eggs, being larger and often more elongated, presented a new challenge. One scholar, after weeks of poring over obscure Latin texts, triumphantly declared that the Romans, being practical people, always consumed goose eggs from the broad end, as it offered a larger initial opening for the notoriously dense white. This was presented as irrefutable proof of the ancient Big-Endian tradition. Little-Endians countered that the very act of eating a goose egg, a less refined food, was beneath the true Roman spirit, and therefore its method of consumption was irrelevant to the higher chicken egg debate. Historians today view this entire ancient precedent phase with a mixture of amusement and exasperation. It's a classic example of historical anachronism and confirmation bias. Scholars weren't genuinely seeking objective truth. They were selectively mining the past to find ammunition for their present-day battles. The past wasn't a source of wisdom. It was a vast, unindexed library from which they could pull any convenient fact to support their predetermined conclusions. There's an ongoing academic debate about which discovery from this era was the most far-fetched. Many agree the goose egg axiom takes the cake. The irony, of course, is that this dive into antiquity only serves to make the debate more convoluted. Instead of simplifying the issue, it adds layers of obscure references and competing interpretations. Now, not only do you have to worry about the king's decree, the scientific consensus, and the theological implications, but you also have to consider what Seneca or Plato would have thought about your breakfast. You hear an older gentleman at the market, a man who once proudly displayed his knowledge of classical texts, now look utterly bewildered. They say Cicero favored the big end, but then I read a passage that suggested Horace was a strict Little-Endian. What is a man to believe? His frustration is palpable. The search for ancient wisdom, instead of bringing clarity, has only deepened the confusion, turning a silly argument into an almost insurmountable intellectual labyrinth. And the egg, once a simple food, now carries the weight of 2,000 years of selectively interpreted history. Every ridiculous obsession, no matter how deeply entrenched, eventually meets the immovable force of reality. The great egg debate, which had consumed a nation and threatened to unravel its social fabric, was finally pushed aside not by logic or a clever philosophical argument, but by the undeniable, grim arrival of genuine crisis. It began subtly, with whispers on the wind. Reports from the countryside spoke of failing harvests, of fields ravaged by unseasonable rains, and of strange blights on the grain. Then came news of illness. A mysterious fever, swift and brutal, was sweeping through remote villages. Soon, the whispers turned into a roar. The war with the rival nation, which had been simmering for years, suddenly erupted into full minor-scale conflict. Armies marched, leaving scorched earth in their wake. Trade routes were disrupted, and the flow of goods into the city dwindled to a trickle. The prices of basic necessities, bread, meat, fuel, skyrocketed. Food, once plentiful enough to be the subject of absurd debate, became a precious commodity. You feel the change in the air. The bustling market is quieter, its stalls emptier. The laughter that had, for so long, been about eggs now carries a grim, hollow sound. People are no longer discussing whether to open their eggs from the big or small end. They are wondering if they will have any egg at all, or any bread, or any fuel to keep their homes warm through the rapidly approaching winter. The coffee houses, once vibrant hubs of intellectual combat, are now hushed and sparsely populated. Meant it not to argue about Fipple, but to discuss news from the front lines, the soaring price of flour, or the growing number of fever victims in their street. The Grand King's proclamation about Big-Endianism, once read with such solemnity, now feels like a cruel joke in the face of widespread hunger. The king himself, who had once spent his days meticulously overseeing etiquette, is now consumed by matters of state survival. His armies are losing ground, his treasury is depleted, and his subjects are starving and sick. The egg debate, which he had so eagerly embraced as a tool of control, now seems utterly, tragically, insignificant. He doesn't revoke his decree, he simply forgets it. He has bigger problems. This is a classic historical phenomenon, one that historians endlessly debate. How do societies shift from petty obsessions to existential concerns? Was it a sudden, dramatic awakening, or a slow, grinding realization? Most scholars agree it was a bit of both. The immediate shock of war and famine certainly refocused priorities, but the underlying weariness and quiet absurdity that had been building for years also played a role. People were ready to let go of the egg. A strange little anecdote from this period recounts how a loyal Big-Endian soldier, home on leave, received a small, precious ration of 2 eggs. His family gathered around him, eager to see him perform the ritual crack, but the soldier, his face gaunt from weeks on the front, simply crushed both eggs into a bowl, mixed them with a little water, and slurped them down, saying, "There are no ends when you're hungry, mother." The story spread, a quiet testament to the new reality. The intellectual elite, once so obsessed with their respective egg philosophies, also find themselves sidelined. Dr. Fipple, the originator of the whole mess, is now reduced to writing desperate letters to former patrons, begging for food. The natural philosophers, who had published their convoluted diagrams of egg anatomy, are now trying to apply their knowledge to more practical matters, like identifying edible wild plants or understanding the spread of disease. Their grand theories about the celestial point seem incredibly silly when real celestial bodies, the sun and the moon, are the only things that matter for planting and harvesting. You walk through the city, and the silence speaks volumes. The street vendors are no longer hawking specialized egg cups. The puppet shows are about brave soldiers and the resilience of the human spirit. The arguments you hear are about survival, not symbolism. The egg, once a symbol of everything, is now just an egg again. And even then, it's a rare and precious thing, consumed quickly, without thought, without ceremony, because hunger, unlike philosophy, tolerates no debate. The grand, pointless war is over, not with a bang, but with a whimper of empty stomachs. As the famine and war relentlessly consume the nation, the great egg debate doesn't just fade, it dissipates, almost vaporizes, into the collective memory. It's not a dramatic capitulation or a formal retreat. It's a slow, quiet, profoundly indifferent dying out. The final gasp of the intellectual battle is not a roar, but a barely audible whisper, largely unheard and utterly unheeded. You hear about it in passing, from the print shop owner who looks more haggard with each passing week. He mentions that a small, 4-1- printed pamphlet has arrived, smuggled across the border at great risk. No doubt, it's titled The Unassailable Logic of the Pointed Apex, a Final Affirmation. It is, he explains with a sigh, another defense of the Little-Endian position, as passionate and intricate as the very first one by Drive. Dipple. But no one cares. The stacks of these pamphlets sit untouched in the corner of the shop, gathering dust. No one comes to argue over them. No one seeks them out for intellectual ammunition. The coffee houses, where such debates once raged, are now nearly empty, frequented only by those seeking a brief, expensive respite from the cold and the hunger. There's no smoke of tobacco, no raised voices, just the quiet clink of cups. The passionate rhetoric that once fueled the debate sounds hollow and absurd in a world where children are begging for scraps in the streets. The elaborate arguments about philosophical integrity or scientific justification for cracking an egg now seem utterly divorced from reality. Who can discuss the moral vacuum of an air sac when one's own stomach is a screaming void? Historians still look for the definitive end date of the Great Egg Debate. Was it when the king stopped issuing decrees about eggs, when the last culinary sedition trial was dismissed? Or was it simply when the last pamphlet defending a specific egg minus cracking method went unread, tossed into a pile of waste paper, its fiery prose extinguishing not with a bang, but with the quiet rustle of indifference? Many scholars agree that the lack of a dramatic conclusion is, in itself, a profound statement about the nature of fads and the brutal efficiency of real-world problems in sweeping away manufactured crises. Consider the journey of this final pamphlet. It was likely written by some zealous Little-Endian scholar, perhaps in exile, who genuinely believed that the truth about eggs would finally prevail, that reason would triumph. He would have poured his heart and soul into it, meticulously crafting every argument, every rebuttal, every appeal to logic and virtue. He would have paid dearly for its printing and its clandestine transport. And then, it arrived in a world that had simply moved on. A particularly poignant detail from this era is that many of the printing presses that had once churned out endless copies of egg-related treatises were now repurposed. They were printing emergency broadsheets with instructions for treating the fever, or lists of available charitable kitchens, or simple maps of military movements. The very machines that had amplified the absurdity were now churning out the grim necessities of survival. You see the dusty pamphlets in the shop, and you feel a strange sense of melancholy. There's a part of you that wants to laugh at the sheer pointlessness of it all, but another part feels a pang of pity for the earnest souls who still believed in the grand importance of the egg. The world has changed. The priorities have shifted. The fight over breakfast, which once seemed like the most important thing in the world, now seems like a distant, embarrassing memory. The silence around the egg debate is deafening. No more passionate sermons, no more scientific treatises, no more street brawls. The Little-Endians no longer need to meet in secret. No one cares enough to persecute them. The Big-Endians no longer need to flaunt their loyalty. The king has bigger concerns. The only thing that truly matters now is the silent, gnawing ache of hunger, and the quiet fear that tomorrow there might be nothing to eat at all. The debate didn't end with a victory or a defeat. It ended with oblivion, a stark reminder that even the most fervent of human obsessions can be rendered utterly meaningless in the face of genuine hardship. Decades pass, the war eventually ends, the famine recedes, and life, slowly, painfully, begins to return to some semblance of normal. The collective memory is a strange and selective thing, holding on to major events like wars and plagues, but allowing smaller, more embarrassing absurdities to quietly fade into the background. The Great Egg Debate becomes one of those things, not quite forgotten, but certainly relegated to the dusty corners of history, usually brought out only by old men with a twinkle in their eye. You are older now. Perhaps you have grandchildren who climb onto your lap, eager for a story before bedtime. They want tales of dragons or brave knights. Instead, sometimes, you tell them about the eggs. Grandfather, a child might ask, holding up a perfectly ordinary boiled egg, why does this cup have such a strange shape? You pick up the egg cup, an old, slightly chipped Big-Endian model that has survived the years of upheaval. It sits in your hand, a relic from a forgotten era, and you begin to tell them the story. You speak of the philosopher, Fipple, and his ridiculous theories. You talk about the king and his solemn decree. You might even mimic the pompous tones of the theologians and the frantic gesticulations of the coffee-house debaters. You describe how neighbors argued, how friends fell out, how the whole city seemed to lose its mind over something so simple. The children listen with wide eyes, sometimes giggling, sometimes looking utterly bewildered. But why, grandfather, they'll ask, their innocent voices cutting through the layers of historical absurdity. Why did they care so much? You just shrug. Well, that's the thing, isn't it? Sometimes people just get carried away. You might mention the secret middle minus crackers, or the fear of the watch, or the silly trials. To the children, it all sounds like a fantastical tale, a whimsical fable from a distant, stranger time. They don't understand the underlying fear, the real societal anxieties that allowed such a preposterous debate to take hold. It's just a funny story about silly adults. This is how history is preserved, often through oral tradition, filtered through the lens of time and memory. The sharp edges of the conflict are smoothed away, the genuine fear and division forgotten, leaving behind only the quaint, almost charming eccentricity of it all. It becomes a cautionary tale, but one told with a chuckle, not a shiver. Historians, of course, have a more nuanced view of this post-minus debate period. They note that while the public obsession faded, traces of the egg war lingered in subtle ways. Certain families, even generations later, might still hold a quiet, unspoken preference for one method over the other, a small familial quirk inherited from their ancestors. Some old proverbs or folk sayings that originated during the debate might still be in circulation, their origins long forgotten, but their meaning still vaguely understood. This academic discussion over the lingering ghosts of the debate continues in scholarly circles. One of the most peculiar examples of this lingering cultural memory is the continued existence of specialized egg cutlery and cups. Though the fervor for factional designs died down, the basic innovations remain. The slender, pointed Little-Endian spoon, once a symbol of defiance, becomes just a good spoon for reaching the bottom of the egg. The heavy, broad Big-Endian cup simply becomes the sturdy one. The meaning is stripped away, leaving only the practical form. As you finish your story, the child asks about the strange old egg cup again. You hold it up to the light, turning it over in your hand. It's just a piece of wood, but it carries echoes of a time when something as simple as breakfast could tear a kingdom apart. You smile, a little sadly. It was a strange time, you say, but don't you worry about it now. You just eat your egg the way you like it. It doesn't matter anymore. And in that small, quiet moment, with the light fading outside and the child's sleepy breathing on your shoulder, you realize that for the first time in a very long time, the egg really doesn't matter. It's just food. And that, perhaps, is the true peace that comes after any great, utterly pointless, historical debate. Fast forward a few centuries, the world has changed beyond recognition. There are electric lights instead of candles, towering buildings instead of thatched cottages, and machines that can fly through the sky. History, once told by grandfathers by the fireside, is now studied in universities, meticulously researched in dusty archives, and debated in academic journals. And among the myriad of topics that occupy these modern scholars, one curious little puzzle sometimes surfaces: the great 17th-century egg debate. You are now a modern historian, sitting in a quiet, climate-controlled archive. You're surrounded by ancient texts, microfiches, and digital scans. Your job is to make sense of the past, to find patterns in human behavior, and to understand why people did the strange things they did. And this egg debate, it's a peculiar one. You read Dr. Fipple's original pamphlet, now a digitized PDF on your tablet. You chuckle at his earnest, almost unhinged, conviction. You trace the king's decrees, the scientific papers, the theological pronouncements. You piece together the fragmentary evidence of the middle crackers, the court transcripts of the culinary treason trials, and the faded broadsheets of propaganda art. It's all there, a strange, tangled thread in the tapestry of history. But the central question remains, what was it really about? This is where modern historians truly get to flex their intellectual muscles. And it's a question that still sparks lively debates at conferences and in academic pubs. One school of thought argues that the egg debate was precisely what it appeared to be, an example of human absurdity taken to an extreme. They see it as a fascinating case study in groupthink, mass hysteria, and the ability of a charismatic individual fibble, or the king to manipulate public opinion over a trivial matter. It's a testament to the idea that sometimes people really do fight over nothing. This perspective often frames the whole affair as a cautionary tale about intellectual vanity and the dangers of allowing petty differences to escalate. Another, more influential, school of thought argues that the egg debate was a proxy war. They contend that it wasn't about eggs at all, but about deeper, unresolved societal tensions that needed an outlet. Was it est and minus in for the power struggle between the crown and parliament? A subtle way to express religious dissent in a time of conformity. A class struggle, where the refined Little-Endians represented the intellectual elite and the commonsensical Big-Endians the traditional ruling class or the common folk. This is where the phrase academic debate continues to this day truly applies, as scholars meticulously pick apart the nuances of the 17th century to find subtle clues. For example, one prominent historian, Dr. L.R. Finch, argues that the Big-Endian emphasis on stability and foundation directly mirrored the king's attempts to consolidate royal power and suppress burgeoning democratic impulses. Conversely, she posits that the Little-Endians focus on reason and individual choice reflected the growing Enlightenment ideals that would challenge absolutist rule across Europe. Other scholars argue that this interpretation is overly deterministic, attempting to impose modern political frameworks onto a purely frivolous historical event. There are also those who look at the no-spooneress or the middle-crackers not just as fringe groups, but as evidence of deeper anxieties about social order and the desire for radical change. Was the act of sucking an egg from the shell a symbolic rejection of polite society? Was the middle crack a metaphor for revolution, for breaking the established binary? These theories are highly speculative, but make for fascinating academic papers. You, as a historian, try to remain objective. You see the evidence for both sides. You see the genuine absurdity in the documents. But you also recognize the underlying currents of power, chaos, and ideology that often attach themselves to even the most trivial of matters. Perhaps it was a combination of both a genuinely silly idea that became a convenient vehicle for far more serious conflicts. You lean back in your chair, surrounded by the quiet hum of the organ. The light from your desk lamp illuminates a faded map of 17th-century Europe. The borders are different, the names are unfamiliar, but the human tendency to find something, anything, to passionately disagree about, remains constant. You close your eyes for a moment, imagining those coffee houses, those courtrooms, those kitchens. It's a distant echo, a faint, almost pointless historical footnote, and yet, it tells you so much about us. Now, let's bring it all back, away from the dusty archives, the scholarly debates, and the faded memories of grandfathers telling strange tales. Let's bring it back to you. You're in your own kitchen now. The soft glow of your modern refrigerator hums in the background, a gentle, almost imperceptible sound that speaks of convenience and refrigeration. Things the 17th century could only dream of. The air is warm, perhaps carrying the faint scent of toast or last night's dinner. Your kitchen counter is clean, maybe granite or polished wood, reflecting the overhead light. It's a space of comfort, of personal ritual, and of absolute, unquestioned freedom. And there, on the counter, sits an egg. It's probably a rather perfect egg, white or brown, almost unnaturally uniform in shape, likely bought from a supermarket where it was part of a neat carton of a dozen others, each one identical. There are no witches to fear, no royal decrees to obey, no theologians to appease. It's just, You pick it up. It's cool to the touch, smooth and symmetrical. You turn it over in your fingers, feeling its familiar weight. For a moment, 1,000 echoes of the past flicker through your mind. You think of Dr. Tipple, railing against the brute base. You remember the king's solemn decree, the glint of the royal spoon. You recall the hushed whispers in coffeehouses, the accusations in courtrooms, the worried glances of your hypothetical 17th-century neighbor. You see the elaborate diagrams of the natural philosophers, the solemn faces of the Geneva Synod. You even conjure the image of the little prince, asking his devastatingly simple question. Big End or Little End, the choice, once freighted with such immense, ridiculous meaning, now means absolutely nothing. And that, in itself, is a profound and comforting realization. This is your kitchen, this is your egg, and this is your choice. Or, more accurately, your non-minus choice. You don't have to choose a side. You don't have to declare an allegiance. You are free from the tyranny of breakfast. You might tap it gently on the counter, spitting the shell at whatever point feels natural, without a second thought. Perhaps it's the big end, because that's where you tend to hold it. Perhaps it's the little end, because it seems easier to crack. Or maybe you're feeling adventurous and try to give it a neat tap in the middle, unknowingly channeling the spirit of those brave, forgotten middle-minus crackers. The point is, it doesn't matter. The weight of centuries of pointless debate has lifted. This is the quiet victory, not a victory of one side over the other, but the victory of indifference, the triumph of common sense over manufactured chaos, the beautiful, liberating truth that some things are simply not worth fighting over, and the poignant understanding that sometimes it takes a genuine crisis of famine, a war, a real threat to survival to remind us of what truly matters, and to let go of the things that never did. Historians still love to talk about the egg debate. It's a classic example used in university lectures to illustrate concepts like social construction, the power of propaganda, and how societies can get caught up in self-minus, sustaining cycles of absurdity. They continue to debate whether the king was genuinely concerned about eggs, or just using it as a cynical to love control. They argue about the true influence of the middle-minus crackers, and whether the prince's question was fact or folklore. But for you, sitting here, holding this egg, those academic debates feel distant, almost as distant as the 17th century itself. You gently peel away the shell, revealing the smooth, white albumen and the vibrant yellow yolk within. The simple act of preparing this food, unburdened by centuries of preposterous meaning, feels almost sacred in its ordinariness. It's a small, personal moment of peace. You scoop out the first bite, warm and familiar, and it's just food, nutritious, sustaining, and gloriously, utterly meaningless beyond that. The enduring lesson, if there is one, isn't about eggs at all. It's about us, about how easily we can be swayed, how readily we can divide ourselves, and how desperately we can argue over nothing, but also how resilient we are, how we can eventually move past the silly squabbles, and how, in the quiet moments of our everyday lives, we find our own way forward, free from the echoes of forgotten battles. You finish your egg. It's good, and the only judgment that matters is your own. And now, as the story settles, let the images soften around the edges. Like old photographs touched by the fading light, feel the gentle pull of slumber, a quiet invitation to release the day's thoughts. Like dust motes settling after the sun goes down, the echoes of history, all those grand arguments and tiny triumphs, are now just whispers on the wind, drifting further and further away. Your world is growing dim and still, the air growing heavy with peace. There's nothing left to worry about, no choices to make, no sides to pick, just the quiet hum of the night, a lullaby woven from forgotten times in the soft rhythm of your own breath. Let your thoughts unfurl and drift, like slow minus moving clouds in a vast, dark sky, carrying you deeper into comfort, deeper into rest. The story is told, the journey complete. You are safe, you are one, and the only thing that matters now is the silent, perfect peace of the approaching dream. The end of the article. Good night.